Hello, my name is Anna Bruckner, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I also practice pediatric dermatology at Children's Hospital Colorado. I've been a member of PeDRA since its inception, and I'm currently serving as chair of PeDRA's Studies Committee. I'm here today to talk with you about clinical research. This is a presentation that I have given to patients as well as to representatives from patient advocacy groups. So it's really designed to be more of, or geared, more towards a lay audience. But I think it really provides a nice overview of clinical research in general. And so I hope that people who view this find that it helps them to understand clinical research a little bit better. All right. As defined by the Oxford Dictionary, research is a systematic study of materials and sources that is designed to establish facts and reach new conclusions. So the keys really here are that it's a systematic approach, and it's really designed to generate new knowledge. So what exactly then is the purpose of medical research? Well, medical research can really serve several purposes. One is to advance knowledge for the benefit of society, to improve the health of people in general, and also to find better ways to treat and prevent disease. You can see here that these are really very altruistic purposes. Research really comes in many forms. We commonly think about research as being sort of divided up into research that can occur in a laboratory. That would include basic science research, which is sometimes also called bench research. And then we have the other side of our spectrum being patient care, which is often called the bedside. So really the goal of medical research is often to take investigations that are starting in that laboratory or at the bench and to bring them to the bedside for patients. That bridge is called translational research. Really, how do we take what we know and have learned from animals or experimental studies and make it relevant for patients? So we have translational research as the bridge between the bench and the bedside, and anything that really kind of falls within the realm of being relevant to patients is considered clinical research. Within clinical research, there are two broad groups of studies. The first being observational studies where no intervention or treatment is given, and the second being experimental studies where an intervention or treatment is given. I think the names are somewhat self-explanatory, but we'll go into a little more detail on the following slides. So as the name implies, for observational studies, the subject is being observed or followed, similar to these fish that are being closely watched by this cat. I had picked this picture just because I think it's somewhat humorous and shows that patients might often feel anxiety about being in a research study because of the close scrutiny, but really observational studies should hopefully be patient friendly. So in these types of studies, no intervention or treatment is given, but information or materials are collected, hopefully in a systematic way. This could include surveys that are given to patients. It could involve participating in a database or participating in a registry, and I will talk a little bit about the difference between databases and registries. This type of research can also be conducted prospectively, meaning sort of looking forward, or retrospectively, implying looking backwards. And in some of these cases, the research does not necessarily even directly involve the patient at all. So for example, in a retrospective type of study, an investigator could review medical records that have already been obtained in order to collect information. So what exactly is the difference between a registry and a database? A database is really simply a structured way to collect information. And a database actually can be a registry, but they can sometimes serve different purposes. Registries are really often designed to collect or attempting to capture data on every single patient with a condition. So as an example of this, I study patients with a condition called epidermolysis bullosa. There was a national epidermolysis bullosa registry that was conducted for many years in the past. And that registry was very, very important in defining the epidemiology and pathophysiology of EB when very little was known about it. So again, the goal of that was really to capture as many patients as possible so that we could really understand on a very broad level what exactly is going on, how common is this problem, etc. Databases can certainly be registries, but they can also serve different purposes. So for example, a database might be conducted in order to look at patients that are seen in a specific clinical population, but the information is gathered in a structured way so that it can be used to answer questions that can generate new knowledge. As an example of this, I conduct a database study called the EB Clinical Characterization and Outcomes Database. This is a study that involves 20 sites in the US, Canada, and Mexico. And in this database study, we enroll all of our patients who present for routine care into the database. Information is gathered from both our clinical interviews as well as from medical records and also from surveys that the patients fill out. And so this allows us to conduct both cross-sectional and longitudinal data analysis. Cross-sectional basically meaning that we're looking at sort of one slice in time, and longitudinal meaning that we can follow that same patient or groups of patients over time to see how their condition changes, either because of the natural history of the disease or because of changes in their care. So this database serves several purposes. We can use it to identify patients who might be good fits for clinical trials. And as I alluded to, it also allows us to look at what happens to patients over time. A long-term goal is also to be able to use the database to compare the effectiveness of our care for our patients, whether or not, and that might be across sites or even, between interventions. Again, the goal here is to really see how we can improve patient care using structured information. So let's move on to experimental studies. I think that from the patient standpoint, when they think about experiments, you might envision a mad scientist such as Gene Wilder, seen here in Young Frankenstein. But again, this should really hopefully not be what is happening when a patient enrolls in a study. So in experimental studies, an intervention or treatment is given, and these types of studies are often called clinical trials. They are really designed to specifically evaluate safety, tolerability, or efficacy of that intervention or treatment. Now, clinical trials can be conducted in a variety of ways. The two most common types of study designs are cohort studies or randomized controlled trials. I'm going to go through the difference between these studies because the type of study design really impacts the quality of the information that we can obtain. So in a cohort study, the assignment to whether or not a patient might receive the intervention or a different treatment is not randomized. So if we are imagining that a patient with a wound has decided that they will participate in a study of a product called Magic Bandage versus typical care, I'll describe how getting assigned to a cohort study will happen and kind of what that might mean in terms of the data that can be generated. So in a cohort study, a patient could present to a clinic and then get assigned to treatment with this Magic Bandage, and the investigator would look at whether or not the wound healing at a specific time point was improved or not improved, or potentially that patient could get assigned to typical treatment, which is often called standard of care. And then again, at that same time point, see whether or not the wound healing was better or not. Now, as I mentioned in a cohort study, the assignment to that arm is not randomized. So if I were conducting this study, I could take the first 10 patients who walked into my clinic and assign them to magic bandage, whereas the next 10 patients who came into my clinic could be assigned to standard of care. The problem is that the first 10 patients, just out of coincidence or because of randomness, might actually have 10 wounds that are much more severe than the next 10 patients who come into clinic. And that might impact how much healing we see, at the designated endpoint. So you can see here that there are definitely some potential disadvantages to this. We want to make sure that when we are conducting comparisons, that we are really comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And so the potential for apples to oranges is really much higher in a cohort study. So in a randomized controlled trial, the assignment to whether or not you receive the intervention is randomized. So unlike that example that I gave where the first 10 patients might go into magic bandage and the next go into standard of care, when I see a patient for this study, they are basically going to be randomly assigned to either magic bandage or standard of care. And ideally, I as the investigator should not know which product they are receiving. That's what we call blinding, which also helps to minimize bias in a study. So in this case, the same thing would happen. The patient would get one treatment or the other. I may or may not know what that is, and their outcomes would be assessed at a later time. So this does allow us to then have a more fair comparison between the groups that would minimize sort of random variation. So in effect, we are basically comparing apples to apples and can truly understand whether or not the bandage is more effective than standard care. So randomized controlled trials are often considered the gold standard in terms of medical evidence for a therapy or intervention. They have the advantage that the data is very controlled in terms of how it is collected. But there can be some disadvantages to a randomized controlled trial. A large number of patients can be needed to have sufficient power to answer the question of whether or not a therapy is truly effective or not. These studies can also be quite expensive and require a lot of resources. This could include not just the investigators and study coordinators, but pharmacists, data monitors, other individuals who are overseeing the research and making sure that it's conducted in the best manner possible. And in some cases, these results might not be generalizable because you are really trying to pick a very specific patient population to receive the medication or the intervention. Patients who participate in clinical trials might often not be as either more or less severe than other patients, or may not have as many other health problems. And so they kind of tend to be ideal patients in the sense that they are healthy enough to participate. But then again, that they might not, the results that you get might not apply to other patients in the general patient population. Still, I mean, I think that these trials can be a great starting point for information, and additional studies are often needed to make the results more generalizable. When we're thinking about bringing a new medication or treatment to patients, there are several steps that need to happen, and these are the phases of clinical trials. Preclinical studies are studies that are done in laboratories or in animals. They basically generate the evidence to show that a potential intervention has promise as a treatment. So this would kind of more or less be analogous to that bench type of research that we had talked about before. Once we have sufficient preclinical evidence, a therapy can begin to be studied in humans. And the first phase of the study is a phase 1 study. The primary goal of a phase 1 study is really to look at whether or not a treatment is safe. And it can also be used to find the optimal dose for treatment in people. So these are often studies that are done with a smaller number of patients, often patients who might not have good treatment options for their condition. And if medications or interventions are found to be safe, then they can advance on to a phase 2 study, which again is looking now more at efficacy and tolerability of the medication. And then finally, going on to a phase 3 study. A phase 3 study is a much bigger study involving greater numbers of patients. And this is really the definitive study looking at efficacy that can hopefully lead to approval of a new therapy if the data is promising. Phase 4 studies are then typically looking more at longer term safety of medication, and these can be quite important because the duration of treatment in a phase 3 study is often relatively short. And when you're thinking about patients who might need to be on these types of treatments for quite a long period of time, the phase 4 study is really important in terms of looking at other side effects that could emerge over time and that were not necessarily going to be apparent in a much shorter term study. So from the patient standpoint, I am often asked, why should I participate in a study? And I think that there can be a variety of reasons for this. I tend to see a great number of patients who have less common problems. And in some ways, I suppose that you could think about every child with skin conditions in some ways as sort of being in this minority in that, children are often sort of second in line when it comes to research. So I think that it's really important for individuals with rare disorders to really stand up and be counted. So if that means participating in an observational study, if what a patient has is uncommon, being included as part of a bigger group really does, I think, help to contribute to the knowledge that medical professionals have about that particular disorder. There is still a lot, that we just don't know in medical practice. A lot of what we do is often based on our experience, but we don't necessarily have good evidence to show that it is necessarily the best way to go about things. And so, I think that understanding, the outcomes, what really leads to a better outcome for patients, these are important, even if we're just thinking about regular clinical practice. Treatment studies, as I mentioned before, can really need great numbers of patients in order to really be truly rigorous and have definitive results showing a product's efficacy. So I think that there's definitely value for patients participating in new treatments, especially for conditions that really have been understudied before. And it's really important, in terms of generalizable medical knowledge, that we fully understand the benefits as well as the risks of treatments in order for us to better inform other patients in the future. So is there a benefit directly to patients for participating in research? I think that one key point that's really important to understand is that research is not designed to be about an individual patient. It's really about contributing to a greater pool of knowledge. And so it's a really an altruistic thing for an individual to say, yeah, I want to participate in a study. Participating in a research study can also be a chance for a patient to meet other doctors, or if the study requires traveling to see new places. And for therapies that are new, research studies do allow the earliest access to those therapies, which could be potentially beneficial for patients. So you might be thinking then, how does research really kind of differ though from patient care? And I've alluded a little bit to this before. When a patient is going to see their physician, that care can be very individualized. It's really all about that relationship between the doctor and the patient. And the healthcare provider is really hopefully should be making the best decision in terms of that patient's best interest with input from that patient. So you might kind of analogize this to sort of being the painter, but who's starting with more or less a blank slate. You can really kind of do what you want and create the picture that you want by working with that patient and the different medical tools that you have at hand. Research, on the other hand, is really not about the patient. As I have discussed before, I mean, research is really designed to generate evidence, and it's designed to contribute to our broader field of medical knowledge. And so when you participate in a research study, you often you are following a protocol. You really kind of need to kind of stick within that guideline that's given to you by the study, because you want the evidence that's generated to be as rigorous as possible. So this is analogous to more or less painting by number. You know, you don't necessarily have as much freedom to do what you want, but at the same time, you still end up getting a nice picture in the end. So we kind of have two different purposes here and two different ways to go about things. And it's important for patients to understand that. It's also important for investigators to understand that, because you know, as I mentioned, in our clinical care, we have so much flexibility, but if you have enrolled a patient in a study, you really do need to stick with the guidelines unless the health and the safety of that patient is being compromised. So I'm often asked, you know, when I'm talking to patients about research, is participating in research safe? And I think it's important to understand that even though there can be some risks to doing something different and participating in research, that the safety and welfare of research participants is really first and foremost. And so research is really governed by three key principles, which include respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Respect for persons covers the concept of informed consent. Patients need to, if they are participating in a study, be fully informed about the risks and potential benefits of the study, and need to volunteer to participate, with that voluntary consent being given in writing. Research should not be conducted without oversight and without consent of the patients. The concept of beneficence includes that really, you know, research should be as benevolent as possible. We are not doing research to harm individuals. We want to make sure that as much as possible, we have made sure that the interventions are safe, and that we've also looked at alternatives, and also that any potential risk to the patient would be minimized. Lastly, there's the concept of justice, and this is really just implying that we want to make sure that we are not overstepping our bounds when it comes to vulnerable populations, and this can include children, and also that, you know, research is not disproportionately affecting one group of people more than another. So I think the key point really here is that research is governed, and there's very significant oversight to it, and that every attempt is made as much as possible to be thinking about the safety to patients, and that the research is conducted in the safest and most ethical way possible. Clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource for individuals to find out about studies that are being done. This is an NIH-funded website where anybody can go on and search based on either condition or study to really kind of look for studies that might be a fit for their particular condition. And once when you go in here and enter, for example, a condition, let's say psoriasis, it will bring up many studies, but you can click on the ones that are of interest and then get information about sites that are conducting those studies. And it includes contact information so that the patient could directly reach out to investigators if they felt that that study was a good fit for them. So in conclusion, I've provided you an overview of clinical research, which includes both observational and experimental studies. Clinical research is something that can advance our understanding of both rare and common conditions in children, but it is important that patients understand the risks and benefits of a study before they agree to participate. That brings us to the end of this presentation. I hope you found it useful. Good luck with your research. Thank you.